All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're going to unpack one of the most powerful and, yeah, controversial essays ever written about the environment. We're talking about Garrett Hardin's The Tragedy of the Commons from 1968. And what's wild is, even though it's over half a century old, it feels like it could have been written yesterday. So you'd think an essay called The Tragedy of the Commons would start with, I don't know, a field of cows, right? But no, Hardin kicks things off by talking about nuclear war. He uses this quote to introduce a really specific kind of problem, the kind you can't just throw more science or more gadgets at and expect it to go away. It's a heck of a way to start. So, what does he mean by a technical solution? Well, you're looking at his exact definition right here. It's basically a scientific fix that doesn't ask us to change our behavior. It lets us keep our values, our morals, our whole way of life exactly as they are. Think bigger farms, more efficient fishing boats. Harding's point is, for certain huge problems, this approach is a total dead end. And that brings us to our first big idea: no technical solution. This is where Hardin makes his move. He argues that the world population problem is exactly this kind of puzzle, one we simply cannot invent our way out of. Here's his main point in a nutshell, and I gotta say, I love this analogy. He says trying to solve the population problem with technology is like trying to win at tic-tac-toe. If you're playing someone who knows the game, you can't win. You can only draw. There's no clever move, no technical trick that will save you. And Hardin says, when we talk about just farming the seas or creating new kinds of food, we're missing the point entirely. The issue isn't a lack of tech, it's a conflict of human desires. So to explain this conflict, he doesn't use a bunch of charts or graphs. He tells a story, a really simple but honestly kind of devastating story that was first sketched out way back in 1833. This is the absolute core of his essay, the story of the herdsman. Okay, so picture this. There's a big, open pasture. It's a commons, which means it belongs to everybody and nobody. Any herdsman can bring their cattle here to graze, and of course, what does every single herdsman want? To maximize their own gain. And how do you do that? You add more and more cattle to your herd. Now this is where the remorseless logic kicks in. So imagine you're one of those herdsmen. You ask yourself, should I add one more cow? Let's do the math. The personal gain, the profit from that one extra cow is all yours. Let's call it a positive utility of nearly +1. Great. But what about the downside? Well, that one extra cow eats a little more grass, degrading the pasture just a tiny bit. But that cost is shared by all the herdsmen. So for you, the individual, the cost is just a fraction of -1. So you get a whole +1, and you only suffer a tiny fraction of a -1. What's the only rational choice? You add the cow. And the problem is, every other herdsman is just as rational as you are. They all run the same calculation, and they all reach the same conclusion. And that is the road to ruin. And when Hardin says tragedy, he's not just saying it's a sad situation. He means it in this deep, philosophical sense, borrowing from the thinker Alfred North Whitehead. The real tragedy isn't the final unhappiness. It's the inevitability. It's that remorseless working of things. No one is the bad guy here. Everyone is acting logically in their own self-interest, and yet the collective result is absolute disaster. That's the tragedy. Okay, so a story about a pasture is one thing, but how does this scale up to our world today? Well, Hardin argues this logic is the invisible engine behind many of our biggest modern crises. And this tragedy actually works in two ways. You have the problem of taking too much out of the commons. That's the overgrazing, the overfishing, the crowded parks. But then you have the other side of the coin, putting too much into the commons. And that is pollution. The logic is identical. It's cheaper for me to just dump my waste into a river than to clean it up. I get the full benefit of that savings, while the cost, a polluted river, is shared by everyone downstream. And Hardin gives some pretty stark modern examples. The oceans, where this idea of freedom of the seas has led us to fish species after species to the very brink of extinction. Our national parks, where the freedom for everyone to visit leads to so much crowding and traffic that the very peace and beauty people came for gets destroyed. And the atmosphere, the ultimate commons, where it's always cheaper for one person, one factory, one country to pollute than to clean up their act. Now, at this point, you're probably thinking, okay, but wait, what about just being good people? Can't we just appeal to everyone's conscience to do the right thing? It's a natural question, and Hardin's answer to it is probably the most controversial part of his entire essay. So let's ask it directly. Why can't we just rely on people's conscience to solve this? Why won't a good-hearted appeal to our better nature work? Hardin's response is, to put it mildly, bleak, and it's based on some very cold evolutionary logic.
Here's the argument. First, he says, people are different. Some people have a stronger sense of social responsibility than others. So you make an appeal to conscience, let's say about family size. The people who listen, the ones with a strong conscience, have fewer kids. The people who ignore the appeal, well, they have more kids. So what happens in the next generation? By definition, a larger percentage of the population is descended from the people who ignored the appeal. Repeat that for a few generations, and you are actively selecting against the very trait you're appealing to. In his stark words, an appeal to conscience is self-eliminating.
And he really drives this point home with a quote from Charles Galton Darwin. Yep, the grandson of that Darwin. The idea is that nature will have the last laugh. The type of human that restrains themselves for the common good, Homo contracipiens, will simply be outbred by the type that doesn't, Homo progenitivus. It's a chilling thought.
So, if technology can't save us and conscience actually makes things worse, what's left? Are we just doomed? This brings us to Hardin's final, provocative answer. The solution, he says, is a concept he calls mutual coercion. Now, I know what you're thinking. That word, coercion, it sounds awful. It sounds like tyranny. But it's crucial to understand what he means by it. He's not talking about a dictator. He means rules and regulations that are mutually agreed upon by the majority of people. It's a social contract that we all consent to. And his point is, we already do this all the time. Think about taxes. We all grumble, but we accept that they have to be mandatory, because if they were voluntary, only the most conscientious would pay and society would fall apart. Parking meters are another perfect example. We don't forbid parking, we just use a coercive measure, a fee, to manage a scarce resource. We have laws against robbing banks. These are all just forms of mutual, agreed-upon coercion that we accept to prevent a free-for-all. So for Hardin, this is the final choice. And it's not a choice between a perfect system and an imperfect one. It's much, much starker than that. He says we have to choose between injustice and total ruin. Systems like private property, taxes, regulations, he admits they're not perfectly fair. There's a degree of injustice baked in. But the alternative, he says, the absolute freedom of the commons, is just too horrifying to even think about. In his view, injustice is better than annihilation. And he closes with this incredible quote from the philosopher Hegel. Freedom is the recognition of necessity. And that just flips the whole idea of freedom on its head, doesn't it? True freedom, in this view, isn't the right to do whatever you want. True freedom is what you gain when you understand the unchangeable rules of a system, the necessities, and you agree as a group to live by them. By giving up the freedom to overgraze, the herdsmen gain the much more important freedom from starvation. And that leaves us with the central, burning question that this essay forces us to confront. A question that is, if anything, more urgent today than it was back in 1968. As we look at our own shared commons, our oceans, our climate, our planet, what freedoms are we, together, willing to relinquish in order to prevent its ruin?